Good morning and welcome, dear friends. Welcome to the CEC live lecture session. Dear friends, today we are taking a topic that is approaches for learning and teaching. And to discuss this topic with us in studios, we have Dr. Renu Tomar. Dr. Tomar is Assistant Registrar in GGS IPU. Dear friends, let's welcome and start the topic. But let me remind you before starting this topic that if you have any questions regarding this ongoing lecture, you can call us on our toll-free number. To call us on our toll-free number, please write down our toll-free number, that is 1800-110-430. So let's get started with this topic and let's welcome Dr. Renu Tomar to the studios. Welcome to the studios, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Seema. Namaskar, viewers. Today we shall be talking about approaches to learning and teaching. What do we understand by approaches? Approaches means that how the teacher approach the subject as to make the learner learn it. So, it is approach which decides that what kind of methodology the teacher would be adopting. Can teacher restrict herself to single approach? Definitely not. Teacher generally intermingles many approaches depending upon the topic she is taking, also depending upon the information which she or he wants to give to her student. If it is a practical oriented subject, then naturally the teacher would be taking a different approach. If it is simply transmitting information to the students, then naturally teacher would be taking different approach. So, what decides the approach which a teacher takes up for deciding that what kind of learning and teaching she is going to take up, depending upon that which methods she is going to adopt. This today we shall be discussing. Friends, basically approaches can be divided into two: traditional approaches to learning and teaching and modern approaches to teaching and learning. In traditional approaches, we would be talking about teacher-centered approach, subject-centered approach, learner-centered approach. Competency-based approach and constructivist approach is something which we would be covering as modern approaches. They are modern but not so modern. They have been initiated almost a century back, but in our formal system, we have not been able to provide them a space, a scope to practice. And it is must that we are able to provide a space and scope to the modern approaches as well. Now, let us begin with teacher-centered approach. What do we understand by teacher-centered approach? Friends, teacher-centered approach, as Paulo Freire said, it's a banking education. Banking education means that the teacher is a bank, the teacher has all the information, and the education system depends upon the teacher as to instruct the student so that the student become informed. So, the major belief behind the teacher-centered approach is that the teacher knows all and learner is required to know from the teacher, and that is why it is also termed as banking education. So, where would be the focus? The focus would be on teacher, the focus would be on teaching, the focus would be on instructing, the focus would be on directing rather than on learning. So, here we are not much concerned about the amount of learning which is going on, we are not much concerned about the learner, we are concerned about what teacher knows. How does this approach help? This approach helps because with the help of this approach, teacher is always able to target the average students and is also able to complete her curriculum in time. Moreover, the bits of knowledge and skills can be transmitted by the teacher on her or his own pace, and the student is supposed to learn it and then provide the information and knowledge which the teacher has shared with him or her in the examination. Friends, let us talk about what is the advantage. The advantage is that the teacher is able to maintain the discipline. Advantage is that teacher is able to concentrate on her curriculum. The advantage is that the teacher would be telling the student whatever she knows, and thereby the student would be able to reproduce what he has been taught by the teacher. This is advantageous to the teacher because teacher is at the center, but the failure of this approach, or we can say the disadvantage of this approach, is that students' participation is dictated by the teacher. So, student is not free, the learner is taken as learner has to take whatever has been communicated by the teacher. The teacher is usually, because she is concerned with the completion of course and content. So, learner is not at the center, rather course and content is at the center and teacher is at the center. Of course, the classroom management is dependent upon the teacher, and if by any chance the teacher lacks the information or knowledge, then naturally this approach ends up as a failure, because the teacher does not have the required information or required knowledge, and naturally he or she will not be able to transmit the amount of information or knowledge which is required. So, the expertise of the teacher in that particular area is very important whenever we talk about teacher centered approach. Moreover, teacher should be motivated. Teacher should be motivated in a sense that he or she has to provide the best information. If the teacher is motivated, only then we can take that the student is also going to be motivated, because in this case the extrinsic mode of motivation like praise, rebuff, reward and punishment are generally used by the teachers. So, because the motivation of the student is also being controlled by the teacher, so teacher has to be very agile, very informed, very knowledgeable, very much interested in the subject, in her students, only then we can say that the teacher centered approach would work. But usually it is seen that in such an approach the teacher end up lecturing in the class and students losing interest, because students are just mere spectator and they are not in the participative mode. So, they lose interest and they end up not learning much. Moreover, because there is no debate in the class, there is no discussion in the class amongst the students, so students do not feel that they are being treated as person, they are just being treated as absorbent, something like you would say that someone who is there listening, absorbing and vomiting out. So, the student does not have a say, the student does not have a participation, the student is not allowed to debate and discuss, they would be only allowed to question or answer as directed and instructed by the concerned teacher. Individual attention is hardly taken into account by the teacher, because teacher is also centered upon the curriculum, and because teacher knows all. So, the individual interest, individual attention, individual problem is not taken into consideration, and there is no scope for developing thinking skill of the students. Thus, it retards the creativity of the children. It is very important to understand that in teacher centered approach the creativity of the children is retarded. That means to enhance creativity of the children, we have to depend upon other approaches. We have to make students more participative. It is advantageous to the teacher. Why is it advantageous to the student? Because evaluation is easy. Evaluation is mostly summative, and teacher being confined to the completion of the course, understanding of the concept is also being taken as per her parameter. So, teacher feels at ease. In we can say a complete different approach, and with at times it is also taken to be an antagonistic approach to the teacher centered approach, which is learner centered approach. What is learner centered approach? Here the learner is at the center. That means we are accepting that the learner knows, we are accepting that learner has some interest, we are also accepting that the individual student is coming to the class because he wants to enjoy learning. So, because it is learner centered, so most of the learning is kept as per the perspective of the students. How can a teacher play a role? At times teachers are found stating that because in the whenever they allow the students to have their say in the class, the result is that the students usually go out of the control and there is a lot of chaos in the class, or because they say that the student doesn't know so much, so allowing the student to participate would be wastage of time and less of learning. Friends, let us understand that most of the learning which is done on our own is something which we retain for longer period, and the learning which we do after having tried it, practically done it, that is the learning which we remember. Instructions are something which we cannot remember for longer. So, there is no doubt to the fact that usually the learner centered approach will provide the real learning to the learner. Here the student would be motivated, here the student would be participative, and role of the teacher would be that of a facilitator. Role of a teacher of being a facilitator means that the teacher would be seeing to it that the student learn on his or her pace and in enjoyable manner. So, student would be allowed to work individually or in group. Student would be learning from the interaction with their peers, and opportunities would be provided to the students for questioning, exploring, experimenting. What would be the role of a teacher? Again, the role of a teacher would be to guide the student, to facilitate the student, to answer the queries of the student. Here the teacher would be just be there for satisfying the need of the student, because here we are accepting that the student knows and the student does have a mind of his or her own and a motivation to learn something. So, we are acknowledging the fact that here the learner wants to learn. The role of the teacher would be to provide the opportunities to the students. The role of teacher would be to seeing how the teaching learning should go, how the assessment has to take place. The role of teacher would also be to provide the democratic climate in the class. The providing of democratic climate begins from the classroom scenario. It begins from the sitting arrangement itself. What kind of sitting arrangement we are providing to the student? If we are dividing them group and making them sit in the circles and allowing them to discuss among themselves, question the teacher and coming to certain points or certain information which they are going to share with the other peers, then naturally the learner centered approach will go successful. The problem exists when the teacher who is a facilitator fails to become a controller. How a teacher would become a controller or a facilitator? Here what the teacher can do is the teacher can say that the time period which is being given to the group to discuss among themselves and come down to the conclusion is, say, suppose 10 minutes. So, when the student know that they have been grouped to come down to certain outcome and that outcome has been shared with them, naturally the students would be learning. Student would be using the teaching learning material as to learn something, as to come out with certain outcomes. What is the problem with it? The problem usually the teacher says that the students end up talking a lot, the indiscipline comes up. As teachers, what we need to understand is that there is a difference between chaos and students discussing among themselves, and due to that noise generated in the class. If noise is being generated in the class because students are talking among themselves, they are discussing amongst themselves as to come down to certain feasible conclusion, then naturally teacher has to overlook that. Teacher has to understand that that is noise of learners and that noise would result in learning only. And chaos would be when there is disturbance or whenever the students are not really doing what they have been asked to do, that is they are not restricting themselves to the learning outcome, then we would say that there is a chaos in the class. At that point, of course, the teacher can change one's approach from learner centered to the teacher centered, and or make them do something in which they will have to concentrate and focus individually, then naturally student would be because the student has to concentrate and focus individually, then naturally the chaos will go away. After few minutes or half an hour or so, then again we can bring them to the same kind of methodology, same kind of a strategy, same kind of approach, which is learner centered approach. So, let us get it clear that in a teacher centered approach we had teacher at a center, in learner centered approach we have learner at the centered. Another thing is that in the learner centered approach we have participatory management on the part of a teacher, and teacher works as a facilitator, providing the democratic environment in the class. And in the teacher centered approach, teacher would be disciplined as well as responsible for having discipline in the class. Student in teacher centered approach would not be allowed to have one say until unless teacher allows, and in the learner centered, student would be speaking, sharing and coming on the conclusions or information or knowledge after having learned on their own. What would be the role of a teacher in case of learner centered approach? The teacher, being a facilitator, would be providing rubrics. Rubrics means vocabulary or structure which would be needed while narrating. That means that if a teacher is taking paragraph writing as a teacher centered approach, then naturally teacher would be providing the structure to the students and then dictating one or two paragraph and then asking students that on this basis of these paragraph write a paragraph on their own. That would be teacher centered approach. If the teacher is teaching the same topic from the learner centered approach, then teacher would be introducing a topic, giving the required vocabulary, writing the vocabulary on the blackboard, discussing, and on that basis the students would be giving their ideas. Those ideas which have been generated from the student would also be noted down on the blackboard, and then students would be asked to write a paragraph in a group in the structure which has been given to the students by the teacher. That the structure would be an introduction, there will be a body, then there would be a conclusion, the conclusion would again be linked to the introduction. So, here the teacher's role would be that of a facilitator, and student will be writing a paragraph based upon the vocabulary and structure given by the teacher on their own, either in the group or individually. Another example which we can take as for the learner centered would be picture narrating. In picture narrating, what teacher can do is teacher can provide the flashcards. So, suppose she provides 6 flashcards to the students and asks the students to first to sequence the flashcard and then generate a story on the basis of that. Either this can be used for writing skill or for speaking skill. In the speaking skill, the student would be narrating on the basis of the flashcard which has been given to them. And in the case of a writing skill, on the basis of those flashcards, students would be writing a narration and then thereby providing their knowledge and their information. Of course, there also in the narration or in the writing on the basis of a flashcard, teacher would again be providing required vocabulary as and when asked by the students, and teacher would also be helping them with the structure if they are stuck somewhere. But here the teacher will not be taking away their creativity. In case the student a group has sequenced the flashcard differently from the other group, then that has to be welcome and that has to be enjoyed in the class. So, the sequence as well as narrating, the vocabulary, even the grammar would be decided by the students only. The teacher would just be providing the help. Another approach which is very important to the students is subject centered approach. What do we understand by subject centered approach and how is it different from teacher centered or learner centered approach? Friends, subject centered means here the subject is at the center. Subject being at the center means the textbook is at the center. Here the teacher is totally restricted to the subject which she has taken up in the class. For example, whenever we read a lesson and then ask the student to read the lesson in the similar way as we have done in the class, and also take the dictation from the same lesson, then naturally the kind of approach which we are following is subject centered approach, because here the who is at the center? The center is the textbook. The teacher is reading, then students are reading the same thing, and the evaluation also would also be done from the same textbook. What is the advantage? Advantage is of course curriculum completion. The teacher can easily complete the curriculum and thereby accept that student would be learning the curriculum and passing the exam. What is the disadvantage? Disadvantage is that is it good to accept that textbook is the only source available for knowledge or information for the teacher. As per the different even the CBSE and the educationist, the textbook is just a reference book. It is there to guide the teacher how to teach and what kind of knowledge he should be teaching to the student. It is not something which is complete in itself. So, insistence on students memorizing the facts by repeating reading, the insistence on the subject matter of the textbook as being a guide to teaching methodology is incomplete, is leading to memorization only, is not resulting in learning. So, we can say that in subject centered approach, the problem is with the approach itself. The teacher might be master. Here we can say that the teacher is master of the textbook, and students are also able to memorize, and on that basis of their rote memory they are able to reproduce in the examination. But is this really serving the purpose of education or purpose of learning? Definitely no. If the student is coming to the class, he is not coming to memorize the textbook. This is something which we have to accept. Moreover, the evaluation is for the advantage of the student. The student is not meant simply for being evaluated. That is not the complete identity of the student. Here, whenever we are taking the subject centered approach as being central to the learning, the students become very much dependent upon that subject, and this even the motivation of the student is decided by the fact that how far they are able to memorize the facts from the textbook and how far they are able to copy from the book whenever they are being asked to answer the questions, and reproduce the exact content in the examination. So, because this is the perspective in this approach which is subject centered, the result is that all other attributes, all other persona of the students are lost, and the student is simply judged on the basis of the fact that how far he is able to reproduce the exact content. Then naturally we are not doing justice to the education system, and definitely it is grave injustice to the students, because students cannot be judged simply on the basis of what they are memorizing and reproducing in the examination. The advantage to the teacher is that the student, it is easy to evaluate because summative evaluation can be done on the basis of a textbook. The advantage to the teacher is also to the fact that the teacher can easily complete his or her syllabi. Then continuous and comprehensive evaluation can also be easily managed by the teacher, because in the case of a learner centered approach where we cannot have the summative evaluation, we will have to depend upon the continuous and comprehensive evaluation only. There the teacher might find it difficult to evaluate the students, because there the teacher will have to really take individual attention to each student as to evaluate them. In this case, of course, the continuous and comprehensive evaluation would also be easy, because if the student is able to vomit out what he has read in the text or what the teacher has read in the class from the text, then naturally the approach is successful, the teacher is successful, and the system is successful, and the student is failure. So, this approach is definitely a definite no. It can be allowed to be practiced in the class to some extent, but practicing it as a major approach is definitely not to be motivated, not to be taken up by the teacher. Another important thing which we need to discuss is that why this traditional approach are in the system still, despite the fact that we almost all the educationists, all the policy framers find these approaches as being very restrictive in nature and not resulting in creativity of the students and not being motivating for the students. Still we are practicing them. We are practicing them because we are following the learning which has been provided to us on the basis of a curriculum, and we have not been able to change our perspective. We here means we the teachers. We the teachers have not been able to change our perspective. We have not been really able to acknowledge and accept the fact that the learner does know something and the learner does have a capability. The learner is capable of an achievement. So, because we don't accept that, that is why we don't take into consideration the modern approaches. So, friends, till now we have discussed the three traditional approaches, which was teacher centered approach, learner centered approach, and the subject centered approach. These are the traditional approaches, and let us be clear about the fact that the most of the time we find that the teachers are not practicing learner centered approach much, and the teachers who are practicing learner centered approach, they are the one who are more democratic in their classes. So, after this we would be discussing about two other approaches, competency approach, and then the next would be the constructive approach to the learning.
Thank you, ma'am. Dear friends, here we will be staying for a really short break. After this break, we will be continuing with the topic. But before going to break, let me remind you that if you have any questions regarding this ongoing lecture, you can call us on our toll-free number, and that is 1800-110-430. So, we will be meeting you after a really short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, friends. Welcome to the CEC live lecture session. Today we are taking a topic that is approaches for learning and teaching. So let's start. Ma'am, before starting, let me ask you a question about what you have taught in this session, that you talk about the subject centric approach. So here when this is a age of blended learning, so why the teacher is restricting himself or herself just to the textbook? Why shouldn't he or she involve a blended learning approach for the benefit of a student, so that a student can have an all-rounded learning approach?
Very good question, Dr. Seema. The problem here is that the teacher restricts herself or himself only to the syllabi.
Yeah.
And because teacher is defined by the pass percentage of the students.
But ma'am, here the question arises that when you talk about the syllabus, but it is the approaches for learning, and when you are trying to make a teacher out of a student, then I guess a teacher should be a jack of all trades, being rather being a master of one. What's your say on this?
Actually, the problem is that we have trained the teachers in these manners. Whenever the teachers who are taking B.Ed, they have been training the students as to take up all these approaches in the class. And students who are going to be teacher tomorrow, they do prepare the lesson plan from the perspective of all the other approaches as well. But when they become the teacher in the schools, then they get to know that they would be judged, their knowledge, their information and their teaching strategy would be judged by the pass percentage of the students.
Okay.
And because the students in a class, in Indian context, we have 50 to 60 students in a class. So whenever we talk about learner centered approach, this is very individualistic. So the teachers are also right in saying that how can we practice learner centered approach in a class where we have the 60 students, and even the 70% or 80% of students are the average learners, and we know that we are going to be graded as on the basis of their performance in the examination, and because student is going to be graded on the basis of the performance, and the teacher is also going to be evaluated on the basis of the student's performance. So they like to restrict to subject centered, and evaluation is also easy, their work is easier.
But as you talked about the learner centric approach, this is also an approach of learning and teaching. So why shouldn't we focus more on the learner centric approach, because it is in the favor of student, and as you know, the teaching is all done for student. So why we should not focus and concentrate on the learner centric approach?
It is in the favor of student, it is not in the favor of a teacher. See, here the clash is between a teacher and a student.
Yeah.
When the teacher know that she is being paid for the pass percentage of the student, her salary is being decided by the pass percentage of the student. So naturally, why would she like herself to be challenged, and why would she like to challenge the students? In fact, she would say that I would be confusing the student if I am going to take learner centered approach. Then the easiest way is to restrict to syllabi, make them rote memory is the one which is practiced in the class, learn it, vomit out in the exam, pass in the exam. I am also in the safe zone and you are also in the safe zone.
But as you were talking about competency before going to the break, doesn't here the competency affects somehow or suffers somehow?
Absolutely. When you are not allowing student to work on his or her own, then naturally student is not learning. What is happening is that the student is memorizing and vomiting in the exam. See, this is a fact that may it be you, may it be me, after we passed our school, how many of us do remember that what we learnt in the school? Nothing. So that means we learnt nothing. If we learnt nothing, then what did we do in all those duration of years? We simply memorized. We memorized and we vomited out. This is why the skills, whenever we talk about any subject is not being taught simply to inform to the students. Why are tables being taught? The tables are not being taught for the students just to multiply in the examination. They are being taught so that they understand what basic mathematics is and they can use that maths in their life ahead. But that is not our perspective in the class. Our perspective in the class is that students should know the table. He or she may not understand that how he or she can utilize in the life, but he or she should be able to write those tables in the examination. So, because our perspective is not utilizing of the information, actually what is learning?
It is just to memorize
the things. It is just to memorize.
To keep a longer lasting memory.
Absolutely. We are not doing teaching and learning in the class. We are doing
we are just accumulating the brains.
Absolutely. We are throwing the information. If the student is good, he catches, then we generally say that the student is very good, because student is capable of catching the information and vomiting out in the exam. Like in the Three Idiots, if you remember, that to be good student means that we should be able to understand and learn what is being there in the books and what is being taught by the teacher.
So, dear friends, teaching and learning, the basic of the teaching and learning is to give you a longer lasting memory. So, this is the crux of till now which we have gained in this lecture, and let's continue with the ongoing lecture. Ma'am, please.
Friends, let us be clear on the fact that a good teacher is the one who is able to utilize maximum number of approaches depending upon the situation, depending upon her students, and depending upon the expectations she has. Expectations means the learning outcome which she has. So, the teacher should be very clear about the learning outcome. Student should be clear what kind of learning outcome the teacher desires or the subject desires. Along with that, the student should also be knowing that how he or she can utilize the information which he or she is learning in the class. Only then we can say that the teaching and learning has gone into. Otherwise, we have memorized and we have done almost nothing. Now, let us talk about the competency based learning. What is competency based learning? Here we are expecting that student does have certain competency and he has certain skills, knowledge and attitude and behavior, and on the basis of what the student has, he is capable of acquiring essential skill, knowledge, attitude and behavior. So, that means the competency based approach believes in achievability of the student, achievability of knowledge, achievability of attitude, achievability of behavior and achievability of essential skill. At times, teachers are found to be stating that in case of competency based learning, the problem is it is not measurable. Friends, let us be clear about the fact that it is measurable. Where is the problem? The problem is that it is for the teacher to decide the parameters to measure, and those parameters have to be shared with the student. If the teacher is able to decide the parameters to measure the competency of the student and then also share them with the student, then naturally it can be measured. To give you an example, let us take the example of a dictation. The teacher gives initially when the child is at the level of second and third, we begin with dictation of the words. Then slowly and steadily we go for the dictation of lines along with the punctuation marks. The level at which student is able to take exact dictation, that means along with the punctuation marks. Punctuation marks means the teacher is not going to say full stop. The teacher would be simply reading along and of course, the punctuation marks are usually being used by the teacher while speaking or reading, and the student is able to take those punctuation marks also in exact manner. Only then we can say that the student has attained competency as far as dictation is concerned. So, now we can conclude that measurable thing is there in the case of a competency based learning. It is very much measurable, but of course, the teacher should be clear that at what level and how it has to be measured, and the student should be knowing that at which level he or she is and how far he has to work to reach the level to be called competent enough, to be called skilled enough. What is the difference between skill and competence? This is also something which we need to discuss, but before that let us be clear about the competency. Competency is something which is communicable, as we just talked about that it is measurable, it is also communicable, because if the learning outcome can be stated quantitatively, then naturally it can be communicated. Similarly, the competency is something which decides the appropriateness of the learner. Appropriateness of the learner means that it provides the standard or level depending upon the characteristic level of the learner. So, learner knows that if he is at C level or D level and how far he has to work as to reach A level, or the vice versa. We can say that we can divide the learning outcome as A, B, C, D, E and say that the E is the highest level and A is the lowest level. So, the student here would be clear about the fact that if he is at the B level or he is at the C level and how far he has to work as to reach the E level. So, from this what we conclude is that competency is communicable, competency is decided on the basis of appropriateness, it is something which can be measured, it is achievable. Now, let us talk about how the competency is different from the skill. Skill refers to a task or group of tasks performed to a specific level of proficiency, while competency is not just acquisition of skill. Acquisition of a skill is just a step to become competent. When a student is able to acquire multiple skills, apply them in all the different situations to the prescribed level of efficiency, only then we can say that the student has achieved competency. Let me repeat. Skill refers to task or group of tasks performed to a specific level of proficiency. But competency means when the student has acquired multiple skill which he or she can apply in different situation, in different scenario at ease, at a prescribed level of efficiency, then we can say that the student has attained competency or mastery. So, competency means the mastery of particular skill. Competency based learning is an approach to the education that focuses on students' demonstration of desired learning outcome, which is central to the learning process. Here, the student would be evaluated individually. Here, the student will not be allowed to progress through the curriculum if he or she has not mastered that particular skill. So, what kind of progression we have? We have student centered progression. Here the student is progressing at his or her own pace, his or her depth. This is a skill, this is a approach to the learning which we usually have to take up in case of a non-formal education system, and we should be taking it up because non-formal education means that students should be allowed to learn on his or her own pace. So, that means the competency based learning should be practiced. Another important thing about the competency based learning is that student would be doing the competency, would be acquiring competency of the one module, and if the student and the teacher both feels that one module is already achieved by the student, then he can jump further. He need not repeat something simply for the repeating sake. So, here the classroom, or you can say the learning, is as per the student, and competencies are identified beforehand and students are frequently assessed on those competency. Student can skip a module if he is found to be competent. if he is able to prove that the desired learning outcome are known to him. If he is able to prove his mastery, then naturally we can allow the student to move further. For example, let us evaluate, let us talk about one skill, which is driving skill. We are teaching two students driving skill. One is being taught about the rules and regulations of the roads in a classroom. Another is being taught rules and regulation on the road in the car. So both the students are being taught driving, and both have been asked to master the rules and regulation of the road. Both would be equated as far as mastery of the knowledge of rules of the roads is concerned. But when it would come to allowing the driving, then naturally the student who has been taught the rules in the vehicle while practicing driving would only be allowed to drive. Here the competency would be differentiated on the basis of the fact that he has one more added skill, which is on hand driving and being introduced to the vehicle on road. Then naturally that student would be allowed to drive on the road, but both would be evaluated in the same manner as far as the traffic laws are concerned, and both would be evaluated with the same parameters as well. The learning outcomes for both would also be same. So what does competency based learning allows? Friends, let us be clear on the fact that the competency based learning empowers learner to understand the competency they need to master. It empowers learner to progress through learning process without time constraints. As we said that here the learner is allowed to learn on his or her own pace, because he is learning on his or her own pace. So that means the progression is also without time constraint. Another thing which we should be clear about the fact that it empowers learner to explore diverse learning opportunities and also collaborate with peers and mentors. Here the learner would be allowed to collaborate in learning activities with peers and mentors, as well as work on his or her own by visiting library, by utilizing the knowledge and information in the library, as well as going online, getting the information and knowledge from the other sources, because nowadays the information and knowledge is available easily to the students. So the question which comes to our mind is that because here the learner knows what learning outcome is, learner also knows that what is his level and which level he is expected to reach as to become competent. So what is the role of a teacher? Let us be clear about the fact that just as in the case of a learner centered approach, teacher here is again a facilitator and a mentor. By being a mentor means that the teacher would be knowing more than the student. It also means that the teacher would also be learner, because he or she has to evaluate the student as well as provide the student with the information and knowledge wherever the student needs. So the teacher would also be learning simultaneously, so that he or she remains more competent than the student. Another important aspect of competency based learning is that we are here the learning artifacts are being created which would represent their competencies, and the student would be reflecting on their own on their learning achievement, and after student has accepted that they have been able to achieve certain level, after that only they would be moving to different other competencies. So here the learner is learner centered, here the learning centered. That means that the learner knows that how he has to improve, what he has to master as to accomplish certain learning outcome. Here we are centered upon developing an academic identity of the student. Here we are centered about the learning outcome as far as the subject is concerned, as far as the information is concerned. This means that we would be diagnostic. Diagnostic means that we would be providing different learning material and assessment to the learner based on what they have already mastered. So, what is the teacher's role? Being a mentor has to provide the because teacher knows that what is the level of the student, and teacher also knows that what kind of material should be provided. So, teacher would be segmenting the material and providing to the student as he is mastering those particular skills. Apart from that, the teacher, because it is a choice based information system, so learner would be selective in selecting between the different learning resources. So, the teacher should be able to provide different learning resources to the students. Moreover, here the teacher has to be personalized, because this approach is completely learner centered. So, here the teacher has to be very personalized in providing relevant timely communication which is tailored to learner individual activities and need. Moreover, teacher has to provide interventions which should be appropriate. That means the teacher has to provide the feedback, the teacher has to provide the guidance, teacher has to provide the activities, teacher has to provide the task which he or she has to design to help the individual's progress. So, friends, from this one thing is clear, that in the case of a competency based learning, the teacher is challenging herself and himself more. Here the teacher has to remain a learner continuously as to help her students. Moreover, because the learning outcomes are clear to both the teacher and students, so teacher has to be alert. Most importantly, the teacher's work is to reduce inefficiency. How would a teacher reduce inefficiency? In this case, in case of competency based learning, the teacher would be reducing inefficiency by including the time spent on learning and by increasing the pedagogical precision and relating it to the student's achievement. And the strength of the competency based learning is in its flexibility. So, this is something which is most flexible. Here the learner are allowed to move at their own pace. So, there are chances that in the same class, in the same age group, there might be students who would be quite ahead of others, and there would be few students who would be very behind the others depending upon their own achievability. Here we don't judge the students on the basis of the fact that how far they are depending upon their pace. Here we judge the students we don't compare the students, we just compare the student with his or her past achievements. Here we are not going to compare the students with each other. Another important thing which we should be knowing is that this supports students with diverse knowledge and background. This is very important point, friends, that because of competency based learning we are able to support students with diverse knowledge, with different backgrounds, with different literacy level, with other related attitudes. This is a learning approach where we can utilize technology very well. Technology means that we can allow the student to use the technology as to get more information in comparison to the traditional approaches. Here the student has more access to the technology, and of course this is the approach in which we can easily teach the skills and vocations to the students.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for this great lecture of yours. Dear friends, from this lecture we get that every approach of learning and teaching is just to excel the student's memory and the knowledge which he or she gains from teaching a subject or learning from a subject. So we at CEC are always ready with such educational and informational lectures for you. So stay tuned with us, and thank you for watching. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you again.